The evening settles gently, and I'm grateful you're here with me once more. Welcome back, dear listeners, to The Curious Case, a quiet corner of the night where mysteries breathe softly and the kettle never quite cools. Before we begin, tell me something. What brings you to these gentle puzzles of the heart and hearth tonight? Is it the comfort of a village whispering its secrets, or the calm certainty that truth, however slow, always finds its way? If you enjoy these peaceful journeys through shadow and teacups, do consider subscribing. It helps our little community grow and ensures you never miss our nightly wanderings. Now then, the night is steady, the lamps are low, and a new tale waits just beyond the turn of the page. Let us begin. The morning drifted over street. Mary Mead, with the kind of quiet certainty that seemed almost ceremonial, as though the village itself had rehearsed its calm through generations. Soft light fell across the rooftops, turning the Prisen 26nd, thatched edges a gentle gold, and the narrow lanes carried the faint scent of dew settling on garden hedges. Miss Marple, who had risen earlier than usual, stepped outside her cottage to inspect the first sprigs of autumn rose that had appeared beside her front gate. She adjusted her gloves with practiced care and allowed her eyes to wander down the lane, observing with the ease of someone who had long ago learned that life revealed more in its smallest motions than in its grander gestures. At the post box near the crossroads stood Mr. Whitaker, the village's retired solicitor, peering into his morning envelope, as though expecting its contents to rearrange themselves into something more agreeable. A few paces behind him, Mrs. Draper, the vicar's housekeeper, balanced a basket of scones while speaking in her usual hurried manner to Miss Parsley, who ran the bakery stall on market days. Their conversation floated through the still air, something about the Women's Guild meeting, the shortage of decent tea biscuits, and a gentle complaint regarding the colder mornings drawing near. None of it was remarkable, yet every word carried the familiar cadence that anchored Street, Mary Mead, to its traditions. From across the green, Colonel Willoughby emerged from his gate with the stiff dignity of a man who had spent a lifetime expecting the world to salute him first. He paused to greet Mr. Whitaker with a curt nod, though neither man seemed particularly invested in the exchange. Further along, young Beth Turner bicycled past the group with her usual cheer, waving brightly as she headed toward the shop to deliver the day's bread order. Her bicycle bell chimed twice light, crisp, and markedly out of place in the otherwise unhurried rhythm of the morning. Miss Marple watched these interactions with her customary gentle interest. She noticed, though no one else did, that Mrs. Draper kept glancing over her shoulder as though waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. She saw, too, that Mr. Whitaker's hand trembled slightly as he folded his letter, a detail most would dismiss, but which suggested that its contents troubled him more than he intended to show. Even Colonel Willoughby, who prided himself on consistency, adjusted his walking stick twice before continuing down the lane. Such shifts in manner were small, almost invisible, yet they brushed against the morning like faint currents beneath still water. The village itself remained peaceful, of course. Chickens scratched idly in the yard behind the Miller house. A distant dog barked with the lazy insistence of one accustomed to being ignored. The church bell had not yet rung, though the first soft echo of its preparation hummed faintly across the green. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, perfectly untroubled, perfectly arranged in the serene fashion Street Mary Mead relied upon. And yet, as Miss Marple lingered by her roses, she felt a slight tightening in the quiet, a subtle shift, no more visible than a leaf turning its underside toward the wind. Nothing dramatic, nothing one could point to directly, merely the faint suggestion that beneath the morning's calm, something waited, something unsettled, as though the day were preparing to reveal a truth that had not yet stepped into view. The village hall stood open to the mid-morning light, its wooden doors propped wide as though inviting the entire parish to step inside and shed the weight of the week. A gentle bustle filled the space, a mixture of chatter, clinking teacups, and the rustle of chair legs being straightened by Mrs. Fowler, who believed firmly that no gathering could begin unless every seat aligned properly with the front table. It was the day of the annual Street Mary Mead Autumn Exchange, a modest affair that combined elements of a bake sale, a tea meeting, and a jumble of local pride. Nothing grand, Nothing extravagant, merely the sort of event that kept a village stitched together at the seams. Miss Marple entered quietly, greeted by the comforting aroma of fresh scones and the faintest hint of lavender polish the ladies' committee had applied to the tables just an hour earlier. She chose a seat near the side wall, where she could observe, without intruding, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. Already the hall was filling with familiar faces. Mrs. Penworthy adjusted her hat for the fourth time as she explained to Mrs. Draper why her marmalade was superior this year. Near the refreshment table, Mr. Clark rehearsed his brief speech about local produce, clearing his throat every few moments as though testing how authority might sound if he finally managed to grasp it. Then, as always seemed to happen, a central figure began to draw attention without making any deliberate effort to do so. Mrs. Lydia Harbot, a woman whose confidence seemed to fill her before she even stepped into a room. She stood near the dais, rearranging a display of old recipe books she had brought to donate. Her poise made it clear she believed the event owed its success, at least in part to her involvement. Even the ribbon on her hat seemed to echo this sentiment, held aloft with an enthusiasm that bordered on competitive. She called out warm greetings to several villagers, yet her tone carried an undercurrent of performance. Every gesture appeared designed to be witnessed. When she lifted a tray of walnut cakes onto the central table, a few heads turned with subtle reluctance, for Mrs. Harbot's baking was known to be ambitious, though not always reliably pleasant. Still, she smiled as though assured of triumph. Miss Marple observed her quietly. She noticed how Mrs. Harbot's gaze flicked just once toward the doorway as though checking whether someone had arrived. She noticed, too, that the woman's smile tightened when she saw Mrs. Albright examining one of the recipe books with visible interest. Pride, Miss Marple knew, had a curious way of slipping through even the most carefully arranged expressions. Across the room, a faint argument was brewing between Mr. Droddard W. Whitaker and Colonel Willoughby about the proper way to store garden bulbs for winter, hardly a matter of great consequence, yet it carried the unmistakable tension of men who had disagreed on many things long before today. Their voices remained polite, but their postures sharpened, like two weather vanes turning against the same wind. The hall remained bright and welcoming, yet in its corners lay something quieter, something small but detectable, like the distant tremor of a teacup before it rattles on its saucer. Miss Marple folded her hands gently, her eyes travelling from one villager to the next. Nothing was wrong, not yet. But beneath the cheerful bustle she sensed the first thin thread of unease beginning to weave itself through the gathering, waiting for the moment when it might be tugged loose. It was shortly after the tea had been poured that the atmosphere inside the village hall shifted, not abruptly, but with the gentle inevitability of a curtain being drawn halfway across a window. Mrs. Lydia Harbot, still brimming with the triumphant energy she seemed to summon for public occasions, approached the front table with something wrapped carefully in a square of embroidered muslin. The cluster of villagers nearby paused their conversation as she placed the parcel in the center of the table with the flourish of someone revealing a prized treasure. "A little surprise," she announced, smoothing the muslin with a proud hand. "Something I thought the ladies' committee might appreciate for our archive display. A rather old piece. Quite special, really. It belonged to my great-aunt's collection." The cloth fell away to reveal a small wooden box, its surface darkened with age and marked by delicate carvings along the lid, tiny vines, twisting roses, and what might have been a faint crest worn almost smooth. The wood had the crest worn most smooth, slightly uneven sheen that comes only from years of careful handling and just a touch of neglect. A faint murmur passed through the hall. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the box with a gentle interest. She recognized the style at once. Victorian, perhaps a little earlier. Not valuable necessarily, but certainly curious in its craftsmanship. Mrs. Albright leaned closer, adjusting her spectacles. "My word, where did you find such a thing, Lydia?" "In my aunt's old trunk," Mrs. Harbot replied lightly. "She kept it tucked beneath her linens. I dare say she meant to pass it down, but we never did open it while she was alive. I thought it might add a bit of charm to today's exchange." Before anyone could admire it further, Mrs. Draper stepped back with a small shiver. "Oh no, not that box," she said under her breath. "I've heard of it. Mrs. Renshaw, your aunt, spoke of it once. She said it brought nothing but, well, nothing but odd happenings. The remark drew a few raised eyebrows. Mrs. Harbot let out a confident, dismissive laugh. Really, Mrs. Draper, you do love a superstition. It's a wooden box, nothing more. My aunt had a tendency toward dramatics, that's all. But Miss Marple noticed the way Mrs. Draper's hands tightened around her scone plate, as though the object unsettled her more deeply than she wished to admit. She also noticed that Mr. Siebling's clerk, hovering near the back, stared at the box with a brief flicker of discomfort before averting his gaze entirely. It was quick, almost too quick, but enough to suggest a memory he preferred not to revisit. Curious indeed. Mrs. Harbot tapped the box lightly with one finger. "There's a little latch here," she said brightly. "One simply lifts it." Mrs. Penworthy gasped. "Don't open it here, Lydia. If your aunt kept it hidden, she must have had her reasons." "Nonsense," Mrs. Harbot replied. "A sensible woman doesn't fear carved wood." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed the slightest hesitation in the hostess's hand, just a momentary pause at the latch, barely perceptible, but present none the less. Confidence, Miss Marple reflected, was often loudest when it masked uncertainty. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A warning offered, a warning dismissed. Two uneasy faces in the room. The simple wooden box sat quietly on the table, yet its presence unexpected, uninvited, seemed to settle into the hall like a small, unspoken question. Something about it did not belong entirely to the cheerful bustle of the morning, and something in the air shifted, just enough for Miss Marple to take note. The wooden box remained on the central table like a quiet guest, whose presence no one knew how to address. Around it, the autumn exchange resumed its rhythm, though the earlier brightness seemed to waver slightly beneath the surface. People moved about with pleasant chatter, yet their glances drifted back toward the box again, and again, as though each person wished to reassure themselves that it had not shifted of its own accord. Mrs. Harbot, determined to reclaim the center of attention, busied herself arranging the recipe books she had brought, stacking them with overly precise care. Her voice fluttered with forced cheerfulness as she called out compliments on Mrs. Albright's lemon shortbread and offered opinions no one had asked for. But Miss Marple observed that the woman's confidence, so crisp earlier, now held an edge of defensiveness, as though she sensed a challenge to her authority and meant to smother it quickly. "You know, Lydia," Mrs. Penworthy remarked carefully, "your aunt kept that box shut for decades. Perhaps it ought to stay that way." "Oh, really, Mrs. Harbot replied with a smile too broad. "We're sensible women, not schoolchildren afraid of shadows." But her hand drifted toward the box once more, and this time Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in her fingers. Pride, Miss Marple reflected, had a peculiar habit of growing sharper when threatened. Across the hall, Colonel Willoughby was engaged in another mild skirmish with Mr. Whittaker about whether the vicar's new plan for the choir seating was sensible or downright ridiculous. Their tones remained outwardly polite, yet both carried that clipped firmness that disguised long-standing rivalry under the thin veneer of civility. A few villagers watched with thinly veiled amusement. Meanwhile, Mrs. Draper lingered near the refreshment table, biting her lip as she studied the wooden box from afar. Each time someone moved near it, she stiffened slightly, clutching her apron with a nervousness she tried to hide behind small tasks, pouring more tea, straightening napkins, adjusting jam jars. Miss Marple noticed the behavior at once. People rarely hid fear effectively. Yet the most curious behavior came from Mr. Clark. Earlier, he had avoided the box entirely. Now, as Mrs. Harbot assumed here, cheerful preening, he drifted closer to the table, not enough to attract attention, but close enough for Miss Marple to observe him clearly from her corner seat. He leaned forward as though studying the carvings, but his eyes didn't linger on the lid. Instead, they darted to the right side of the box, where a tiny metal hinge sat slightly misaligned. It was a minuscule detail, the sort that would vanish to almost anyone's eye, yet his gaze fixed on it for the briefest second, before he straightened abruptly and stepped back. Miss Marple followed his glance. Yes, there it was, a hinge slightly lifted, no more than a hair's breadth, as though the box had been opened recently, and hastily at that. Someone had handled it before today. Someone had tampered with it. Someone had not wanted that fact noticed. The chatter continued around the hall, warm and harmless in tone, yet a thin cord of tension threaded through the morning, quiet, persistent, and distinctly out of tune. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap, her expression unchanged. But her eyes, sharp despite their softness, had already begun to follow the first shadow in an otherwise peaceful room. The autumn exchange had reached that gentle midpoint where the bustle softened into a comfortable hum. Teacups clinked lightly, the scent of warm scones drifted through the air, and villagers settled into small groups, pleased with their morning's conversations. Mrs. Fowler began distributing plates of walnut cake, moving with the brisk assurance of someone who believed efficiency was next to virtue. When she reached Mrs. Harbot, she placed a slice on the woman's plate with an approving nod, and the hostess accepted it with a proud little smile, determined to enjoy her moment of triumph. "Do try it," Lydia urged those around her. "It's an old family recipe. Quite special, really." She lifted the fork with a flourish, as though the act of tasting her own cake were a performance in itself. Around the hall, small talk resumed, Mrs. Penworthy debating the merits of candied peel, Colonel Willoughby offering unsolicited opinions about winter storage habits, but Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Draper watched Lydia with an anxious intensity, her hands frozen on the jam jar she had been arranging. Nervousness, Miss Marple reflected, rarely had just one cause. Mrs. Harbot took her bite. It happened almost at once. A tiny hesitation, a blink, a sudden tightening around her eyes. Then, without warning, the fork slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the plate. Lydia gripped the edge of the table, swayed, and let out a faint gasp before collapsing backward into her chair. The sound rippled through the hall with startling swiftness, like a pane of glass struck at its weakest point. The room erupted. Mrs. Penworthy shrieked and dropped her teacup. Colonel Willoughby stumbled to his feet with a sharp bark of alarm. Mrs. Draper rushed forward but stopped short as though afraid to touch the fallen woman. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and the orderly calm of the morning dissolved into confusion within seconds. "Fetch Dr. Collins," someone cried. "He's outside, he just arrived," another voice called. The doctor hurried in moments later, his bag already in hand, his expression tightened into professional focus. He knelt beside Mrs. Harbot, checking her pulse, then her eyes, then the faintest tremor of breath. The hall waited silent now, but thick with fear. After a long moment, Dr. Collins exhaled heavily and looked up. "I'm afraid," he said quietly. "She's gone." A collective gasp rippled across the room. Someone began to sob. Mrs. Draper covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Mr. Clark backed away inch by inch, his face pale beneath the hall's lantern light. Miss Marple remained in her seat, her knitting untouched beside her. She did not panic, nor attempt to push through the crowd. Instead, she watched, silently, her eyes traveling from one person to the next, collecting details with the calm precision of someone who had learned to trust small truths over dramatic claims. 3 clues settled gently into her mind. A scent, faint, unfamiliar, drifting from the cake plate. A gesture, Mr. Clark's hand briefly clutching his coat pocket before he stepped back. A missing detail, the wooden box on the table, its lid now sitting ever so slightly more open than before. The tragedy had come swiftly, but its cause, Miss Marple suspected, had roots far quieter and far older than the moment of collapse itself. The moment Dr. Collins uttered his quiet conclusion, the hall seemed to lose its balance. Not physically, but in spirit, something steady inside the room shifted, as though the familiar order of village life had been nudged off its well-worn track. The shock rolled through the gathering like a sudden chill, catching each person at a different angle. A few gasped, others whispered, and several stepped backward instinctively, as if distance alone might lend clarity. Mrs. Penworthy clutched her handbag to her chest, her voice trembling as she whispered, "It's that box. I knew nothing good would come from it. The words slipped into the room with surprising speed, latching onto ears already hungry for explanation. Mrs. Draper sank onto a nearby chair, her apron bunching in her hands. Her aunt warned about it, she murmured. Said strange things happened. Said people fell ill after touching what wasn't meant to be touched. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wooden box, as though expecting it to shift of its own accord. This alone was enough to spark the first threads of rumor. "Oh, nonsense," Mrs. Albright said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Superstitions are for stories, not real life." Yet even she could not help glancing toward the box, as though her own words required reassurance. Still, her aunt keeping it hidden for so many years. Well, that is curious. Colonel Willoughby attempted to restore order with the bracing authority he used during parish debates. "Let's have no talk of curses," he insisted. The woman collapsed, that's all. There must be a practical reason. But he spoke too loudly, too quickly, and his abruptness only sharpened the villagers' unease. Within seconds the murmurs multiplied. "Did you see the way she touched it before eating? Maybe the box was opened this morning. Perhaps that released something. Her great-aunt died suddenly too, didn't she? Someone should close the lid. It looks wrong like that." The whispers piled up, thin but relentless, feeding one another like dry leaves catching along a windy path. People edged away from the central table, forming a hesitant circle around Mrs. Harbot's fallen form, as though proximity alone risked inviting misfortune. Amidst the tangle of speculation, Miss Marple sat very still. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and listened not to the noise itself, but to the pattern beneath it. Rumors, she knew, rarely formed without roots. Beneath exaggerated notions of curses lay genuine fears. Beneath fears lay motives. And beneath motives, truth. She watched Mr. Clark again. He stood near the back, nearly pressed against the bookshelf as though hoping invisibility might spare him from further attention. His gaze did not rest on the box nor the body, but on the cake plate, specifically on the slice that remained untouched beside Lydia's fork. A peculiar fixation, subtle but telling. Miss Marple noted his pallor, the tension in his jaw, and the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. He was not frightened of superstition. He was frightened of something far more specific. Across the room, Mrs. Fowler attempted to calm the guests, though her hands shook as she straightened tablecloth edges. "Please, everyone, sit if you can. Let's take a breath. Dr. Collins will advise us." But no one Saturday. No one breathed easily. Only the wooden box, resting quietly on the table, seemed utterly unchanged by the chaos it had inspired. And Miss Marple, seated in her corner with steady eyes, listened closely to every fragment of fear that escaped into the room, each rumor revealing more about its speaker than the object itself. The arrival of Inspector Slack punctured the charged atmosphere of the hall with the blunt firmness of someone accustomed to taking control, regardless of whether the situation required finesse or merely patience. He strode inside with his notebook tucked under his arm, and a look of brisk determination that suggested he had already formed an opinion before even reaching the doorway. His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on the fallen Mrs. Harbot before shifting to the villagers, who seemed to shrink beneath his authority. All right, he declared, raising a hand. "Let's have some order here. No talk of curses, if you please. We'll keep ourselves sensible." His statement drew a few relieved murmurs, though the faint tremor beneath them suggested that the talk of superstition had left its mark. Inspector Slack approached Dr. Collins, exchanged a few curt words, then turned toward the crowd with the air of someone ready to settle the matter swiftly. "So," he announced, clearing his throat, "we'll treat this as a straightforward case. Most likely a choking incident or a sudden cardiac failure brought on by excitement and—" Mrs. Penworthy stiffened. "She wasn't excited, Inspector." She had barely taken a bite. Yes, he interrupted. "But these things happen, especially when one is indulging in rich foods. Walnut cake can be rather heavy on the system." The room rustled with uncertain agreement, though several faces showed doubt. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting how he avoided looking at the cake plate too long, as though preferring simplicity over complication. Inspector Slack followed her gaze and clicked his tongue impatiently. Now, if we're to consider other possibilities, and I'm not saying we should, it seems clear the matter concerns the cake itself. Who prepared it? Mrs. Fowler, already pale from the morning's shock, raised her hand. It was part of the committee's spread, Inspector. I baked some, Mrs. Penworthy supplied biscuits. And Lydia, well, Lydia contributed that walnut cake herself. Aha. Inspector Slack pointed his pencil with decisive triumph. Then, the simplest explanation is this. She used an ingredient she was sensitive to, a personal oversight. Unfortunate, yes, but not suspicious. A murmur rippled through the hall again, this one mixed with both relief and uncertainty. Some nodded quickly, eager to accept any conclusion that restored normalcy. Others exchanged glances, the doubt sharpening at the edges. Miss Marple remained silent. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, and her eyes travelled from the inspector to the wooden box, then to Mr. Clark, who had grown increasingly restless. She could almost feel the pressure of Slack's eagerness to be done with the matter, his long-standing impatience with anything that hinted at complexity. Of course, Inspector Slack continued, if someone can confirm she baked that cake herself, that settles it. A tragic accident. Nothing more. Mrs. Draper wrung her hands. But she said she hadn't made walnut cake in ages. She mentioned it this morning. She seemed unsure of the recipe. Slack waved a dismissive hand. People forget recipes. Doesn't make it foul play. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her voice gentle but steady. Inspector, might it not be wise to consider that Lydia was a woman of strong habits? She rarely varied her baking, and she did seem unusually proud of this particular cake. Slack frowned. Meaning what, Miss Marple? She offered a mild smile. Only that pride often hides a reason, and reasons, in my experience, can be rather telling. The inspector sighed an impatient, weary sound. We'll handle this properly, but I assure you, all signs point to the obvious. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her eyes, soft, yet perceptive, held a quiet certainty. The obvious was rarely the truth. The afternoon settled over street. Mary Mead with a hush that felt almost deliberate, as though the village itself meant to tiptoe around the morning's events. While most residents remained indoors discussing, repeating, and inevitably reshaping the tragedy in their living rooms, Miss Marple chose instead to follow her own small, careful rhythm. She fetched her shawl, pinned it with neat precision, and stepped out into the lane for a few quiet calls. She moved without hurry, her gait steady, her expression gentle. It was her way, not to interrogate, but to listen. Her first stop was Mrs. Penworthy's cottage, where the curtains fluttered anxiously, and the kettle had clearly boiled more times than necessary. Mrs. Penworthy nearly pulled her inside. Oh, Miss Marple, such a dreadful thing. Such a dreadful thing indeed. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, stirring it slowly while allowing Mrs. Penworthy's words to spill into the room. There was no malice in them, only nerves, curiosity, and a lingering tremor of fear. She was proud of that cake, Mrs. Penworthy whispered. Too proud, perhaps. She liked being the center of things, you know. Always did. And people seldom thanked her as much as she felt she deserved. A small motive, nothing dramatic, merely wounded pride, an emotion that often sowed more trouble than outright anger. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, then guided the conversation with the lightest touch. Did she seem uneasy this morning, before we all arrived? Mrs. Penworthy hesitated, twisting her napkin. Now that you say it, she did. Look behind her a few times, as if expecting someone. And when Mrs. Draper mentioned that wooden box, Lydia snapped at her. Snapped quite sharply, in fact. Miss Marple tucked the detail gently into her thoughts. She stayed a few minutes longer, offering reassurance, then excused herself with the warm politeness that always softened her departure. Her next visit was to Mrs. Albright, who greeted her with a troubled sigh and an immediate refill of the teapot. Mrs. Albright was not prone to dramatics, but she possessed a sharp memory and a sharper sense of social currents. "It's the box," she insisted softly. It unsettled her. Not that I believe in curses, of course, but Lydia did not enjoy being questioned. She liked her authority neat and tidy. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And was anyone challenging it today? Oh, several, Mrs. Albright replied. Mr. Clark, for one. He hardly said a word, but he watched her so closely. And Mrs. Draper, poor thing, she looked frightened the moment the box appeared. Another thread, subtle but distinct. By the time Miss Marple stepped back into the evening air, the village seemed quieter still. Windows glowed softly against the dimming light, and a few chimney plumes rose upward in wavering spirals. The silhouettes of the cottages held their usual peace. Yet, the conversations within them carried the first signs of emotional tension. Small grievances, old rivalries, hidden fears all weaving themselves through the tragedy like threads waiting to be drawn together. Miss Marple paused at the gate before returning home, her eyes thoughtful. People she knew often revealed more in their grief than in their comfort. And today, Street, Mary Mead had revealed quite a bit indeed. The following morning arrived with a thin veil of mist resting along the hedgerows, softening the edges of the village lanes. Miss Marple set out early, her steps unhurried, her mind steady. She preferred morning calls for delicate inquiries. People tended to be more candid before the day's tasks claimed their attention. The quiet air, too, seemed to invite honest words. Her first destination was the Turner garden, where young Beth Turner knelt beside the flower beds, trimming the last of the dying marigolds. Beth looked up with a start, but smiled warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting anyone so early." "I'm merely enjoying the morning," Miss Marple replied gently. "And admiring your marigolds. You've cared for them very well." Beth flushed at the compliment, wiping her hands on her apron. Yet Miss Marple sensed a nervous flutter beneath the girl's bright demeanor, something unsettled that hadn't been present days earlier. After a few moments of light conversation, Beth's gaze drifted toward the lane. "It was awful. What happened to Mrs. Harbot? I can't stop thinking about it." Miss Marple nodded, allowing the silence to coax forth the rest. Beth lowered her voice. "I probably shouldn't say this, but she wasn't always kind, especially with her baking. She used to belittle Mrs. Fowler at the Women's Guild meetings, said her scones were stodgy and her puddings lacked refinement." "Did Mrs. Fowler mind terribly?" Miss Marple asked. Beth hesitated. She pretended not to, but I saw her crying once after a meeting. She said Mrs. Harbot enjoyed taking credit for recipes that weren't hers. There was a quarrel once, quiet but sharp, about a walnut tart from 3 years ago. Mrs. Fowler believed Lydia had stolen the idea from her. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her mind sharpened. Rivalry, pride, insult, these were often the tinder beneath much larger flames. After parting from Beth, Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage garden, where Mr. Whittaker stood trimming the rose arch with exaggerated diligence. His movements were steady enough, but there was something brittle in the way he held the shears. "Good morning, Mr. Whittaker," she said. "A lovely day for tending roses." He forced a small smile. "One must keep busy, Miss Marple. Helps the mind stay orderly." Miss Marple glanced toward a withered bloom he had sliced a touch too deeply. "Order is a comfort, I agree. And yesterday's events were rather disconcerting." Mr. Whittaker swallowed. "Tragic. Very tragic. But perhaps not unexpected. Lydia was well, she carried many grudges. She once threatened to expose me over a small clerical error from years ago. Nonsense, of course, but she enjoyed holding such things over people. Did the quarrel end peacefully?" Whittaker's jaw tightened. "As peacefully as Lydia ever allowed." Miss Marple thanked him and continued her stroll. Each step down the lane added weight to her growing sense of the truth. Pride wounded, egos bruised, old arguments resurfacing. Street Mary Mead, in its gentle way, held conflicts just as sharp as any found in larger towns. By the time she reached her cottage gate once more, she had gathered a handful of small stories, none dramatic, none violent, but each held the unmistakable undercurrent of human nature at strain. And human nature, Miss Marple knew well, was seldom irrelevant. By late afternoon, the village had settled into that muted stillness that often follows a night of heavy conversation. Windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains, and distant kettles hissed their routine comfort. Miss Marple, after a brief rest, resumed her quiet inquiry with the practiced ease of someone who understood that truth rarely appeared all at once. Rather, it unveiled itself in small, overlapping admissions, each one soft enough to overlook, yet sharp enough to matter. Her next stop was Mrs. Fowler's cottage. The door opened before she could knock twice, revealing a woman whose warmth usually shone brightly, but now flickered beneath visible strain. Her apron was dusted with flour, though she hadn't baked that afternoon, and her smile faltered at the edges. "Oh, Miss Marple, please come in," she murmured. Miss Marple stepped inside, allowing herself to be led to the small table where 2 teacups already waited, untouched. Mrs. Fowler sat down heavily, her fingers weaving and unweaving themselves around her handkerchief. "I'm afraid," she said quietly, "that people may say things, that I had reason to dislike Lydia. Which is true, but disliking someone doesn't mean wishing harm." "I quite understand," Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Fowler exhaled shakily. "She embarrassed me, you know, more than once. At guild meetings, at bake sales, at the harvest festival 3 years ago. I made a walnut tart. Simple but good. The vicar's wife praised it. Then Lydia. Oh, she couldn't bear the attention. She claimed she had taught me the recipe." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I recall hearing something of that event." "It wasn't her recipe," Mrs. Fowler whispered. "It was mine from start to finish. But she enjoyed taking credit, you see. Said it kept the committee organized, as though praise were hers to distribute. A small, wounded pride deep enough to bruise, not deep enough to break. Yet emotions like that seldom sat idle." Miss Marple did not push. Instead, she let the silence open more space. Mrs. Fowler swallowed hard. "And last month she submitted a scone recipe to the Parish Chronicle baking column, my scone recipe. The one I perfected over years. She said she'd polished it." Her voice trembled with the memory. When I confronted her, she laughed. Laughed, Miss Marple. Said I was being overly sentimental. Did anyone else know of this quarrel? Mrs. Penworthy overheard, and Beth Turner. Perhaps 1 or 2 others. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It seems Lydia collected rivalries rather easily." Mrs. Fowler wiped her eyes. "I oughtn't speak ill of the dead, but she held grudges too. Quietly, carefully. She never forgot a slight, real or imagined." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression still gentle but her mind sharpening around the edges. Recipes stolen, credit claimed, pride bruised, rivalries nurtured until they grew roots of their own. Lydia Harbot had woven herself deeply into the domestic fabric of Street Mary Mead, but not with tenderness. Perhaps with something more possessive, more territorial. As Miss Marple stood to leave, Mrs. Fowler gripped her arm lightly. You don't think this has anything to do with yesterday, do you?" Miss Marple's reply was soft. "Human nature can be quite intricate. And motives, my dear, have a way of lingering beneath the surface long before they rise." Outside, the evening air felt cooler, almost reflective. The emotional truth, Miss Marple thought, was beginning to take shape, and with it, the first true glimpse of motive. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple made her way down the narrow lane toward the Harbot cottage. The fading light brushed the hedges with a muted silver, and the air carried the faint scent of damp leaves settling into evening stillness. She walked without haste, knowing full well that people tended to speak most honestly once the day had tired them out. And there was one person in particular who had hovered at the edge of the morning's commotion, with a fear far deeper than simple shock. At the cottage gate, Miss Marple paused before lifting the latch. Dora Finch, Lydia Harbot's maid of all work, was outside, sweeping the front step with small, frantic strokes that did little to move the dust. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements uneven signs Miss Marple noticed immediately. Dora looked up at the sound of the latch, and the panic in her eyes softened only slightly when she recognized the visitor. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect. I mean, please, "Do come in," Dora stammered, setting the broom aside. Her hands twisted in her apron, and her breath came in thin, shaky pulls. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "My dear, I thought you might like a little company this evening, and I brought a jar of my blackberry jam. You always said you liked it with your tea." The kindness cracked something inside Dora. Her eyes filled, and she nodded quickly before leading Miss Marple to the tiny kitchen. The kettle was already warm on the stove, evidence she had boiled it more than once, likely in an effort to steady her nerves. Miss Marple waited while Dora poured the tea, then offered the jar. "Here, let's sweeten things a bit. It helps when one has had a difficult day." Dora's hands trembled as she took the spoon. She stirred silently for several moments before whispering, "Miss Marple, I think something was wrong before we even left the house yesterday." Miss Marple did not lean forward or show any surprise. She simply stirred her own tea with calm, encouraging patience. "Take your time, dear." Dora nodded, swallowing hard. "Mrs. Harbot had a visitor yesterday morning, before the exchange. I didn't see who it was, but I heard voices, sharp ones. She was angry, very angry, and she said something like, 'You'll not hold it over me any longer.' Then the front door slammed." "And you did not recognize the voice of the visitor?" Miss Marple asked softly. I think it was a man," Dora whispered, "but quiet, as though he didn't want to be heard." A chill of understanding brushed Miss Marple's thoughts. "And after this visitor left?" Dora hesitated. "Mrs. Harbot went straight to her room. I wasn't meant to look, but when she came down again, the wooden box was missing from her cabinet. She must have taken it out then. And later, before we left for the hall, I saw something else, something strange." Miss Marple waited, her gaze warm but steady. Dora lowered her voice to a trembling whisper. There was a small bottle on her dressing table, one I'd never seen before. Dark glass, no label, and it smelled sharp, bitter. Nothing like her usual things. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind locked into sharp clarity. A secret visitor. A bitter, smelling bottle. And the box removed from hiding. The turning point had arrived. Quietly, softly, exactly as truth often does in Street Mary Mead. The morning light filtered gently through Miss Marple's sitting-room curtains, casting a pale, steady glow across the small wooden table she had carefully cleared. It was the sort of light she preferred for delicate work, soft enough not to glare, strong enough to catch what others might overlook. And today, she intended to look closely indeed. After her visit with Dora Finch the previous evening, Miss Marple had made a quiet request to Mr. Whittaker, who handled the Harbot estate affairs until formal inquiries began. He had agreed, reluctantly but respectfully, to let her borrow the wooden box for a brief private inspection. Miss Marple's reputation for keen perception carried more weight in Street Mary Mead than any official title. Now the box rested before her, its carved roses muted beneath years of handling. Miss Marple opened it gently, careful not to disturb what lay inside. The lid creaked faintly, a hesitant sound, as though it remembered being forced open recently and had not yet forgiven the intrusion. Inside lay a small folded sheet of paper, a frayed ribbon, and a sliver of fabric, no larger than a thumbprint, all seemingly harmless. All carefully arranged. And yet, each item felt ever so slightly out of alignment, as though someone had handled them with restless urgency. Miss Marple lifted the sheet of paper first. Under the morning light, the creases revealed themselves with telling irregularity. Some folds were old, softened, rounded, familiar. But one crease, running diagonally near the corner, was newer, sharper, out of place. She unfolded the paper. The writing inside, though not much more than a list of ingredients, carried two different hands. The original script was tidy, old-fashioned, looping neatly without hesitation. But beneath one of the lines, almost hidden within the curve of a letter, lay a quick, cramped notation written in a distinctly modern hand. A correction, a substitution. Reduce walnut, add essence. Miss Marple leaned closer. The ink of the newer note had smudged slightly, not from age, but from haste. someone writing quickly, anxious to finish before being seen, and someone who wished to alter a recipe without drawing attention. She set the paper aside and examined the ribbon next. It was ordinary at first glance, cream-colored, faintly scented with lavender from the drawer where it must have been stored. But near one end, she noticed a small, dark stain. Not lavender. Something sharper, something closer to the bitter scent Dora Finch had described. Miss Marple touched the stain lightly with her fingertip, then lifted it to her nose. Yes, a faint, acrid trace remained. Not enough to identify on its own, but enough to confirm it did not belong to the ribbon's original use. Finally, she examined the small piece of fabric. A delicate scrap, torn rather than cut, as though ripped accidentally in haste. The pattern, pale blue with a thin white stripe, was familiar. Miss Marple frowned slightly, recalling the clothing worn at the exchange. Someone in that hall had worn a garment matching this fabric. Someone nervous, someone watchful. She placed all three items back into the box, arranging them carefully. The evidence was quiet, almost timid in its presentation, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that truth rarely arrived with fanfare. It came instead in faint ink smudges, in hurried handwriting, in misplaced stains, in torn corners that did not quite belong. Someone had tampered with the contents of this box, and not long before Lydia Harbott's death. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon in her sitting room, the wooden box closed once more, her thoughts arranged as neatly as the teacup resting beside her. She had learned over many years that mysteries were seldom solved by sudden revelations, but by gently placing each detail upon the table until the pattern revealed itself. And today, as she pieced together the sequence of events, she began to notice that certain moments failed to sit comfortably beside one another, like mismatched tiles in an otherwise tidy mosaic. She started with the morning of the autumn exchange. At that time, Lydia Harbott had been seen leaving her cottage at precisely 9:30. Mrs. Draper confirmed she had watched Lydia from her kitchen window, surprised that the woman seemed to be rushing rather than basking in her usual punctual pride. Beth Turner, bicycling past, had greeted Lydia moments later. Beth recalled that Lydia looked preoccupied, muttering something and adjusting her gloves with unusual irritation. Yet Dora Finch's account complicated matters. She had heard a quiet but heated argument inside the cottage shortly before Lydia stepped out. The visitor had left through the back gate, unseen by neighbors, and Dora was certain that Lydia had taken the wooden box from her cabinet in haste, something she never would have done casually. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest. If the argument and the removal of the box happened before Lydia left, then Lydia already had some plan or some fear nagging at her when she arrived at the hall. Next, Miss Marple considered the cake. Mrs. Fowler had insisted that Lydia seemed uncertain about the recipe that morning. She had even mentioned that Lydia hadn't baked walnut cake in years, yet Lydia had claimed it confidently as her contribution, asserting mastery over it as she always did. More curious still, the correction on the recipe paper, "Reduce walnut, add essence," must have been written recently. But Lydia was never one to modify her recipes impulsively. Pride alone would have stopped her from altering an old family formula, which left only one possibility. Someone else tampered with the recipe before Lydia baked the cake. But when and how? Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, allowing the quiet to settle around her like a slow mist. Then the threads began to align. If the visitor came early, if the recipe was altered early, if the box was taken out early, then the cake itself must have been prepared earlier than Lydia claimed. Lydia had told several people she baked it just before coming to the hall. But Dora had never smelled baking that morning. Instead, she recalled Lydia opening and closing drawers with frantic energy. And the kitchen oven, Dora said it had been cold when she cleaned it shortly after Lydia left. Cold, completely cold. Miss Marple opened her eyes. A small twist in the timeline, quiet but unmistakable. Lydia had not baked the cake that morning. It must have been prepared the day before, or perhaps by someone else entirely. And if the cake had been baked earlier, then someone had ample opportunity to tamper with it before the event, to alter it, to add something, to switch the ingredients. Or even Miss Marple felt the thought settle in place to switch the cake altogether. The timelines no longer aligned, which meant someone had carefully arranged them not to. Miss Marple rose from her armchair and walked toward the window, letting the afternoon light settle across her thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer scattered, they hovered in place, waiting only for her to gently turn them until they clicked. And as she traced the sequence of events once more, a quiet certainty began to form. Not dramatic, not bold, simply true. The cake Lydia Harbot brought to the autumn exchange was not the cake she claimed to have baked. The recognition came not from any single observation, but from the sum of many. The cold oven Dora Finch had dutifully cleaned, the lack of any baking scent in the Harbot cottage that morning, the creased recipe paper with its hurried correction, the dark stain on the ribbon, and the frightened glance Mr. Clark had given the cake plate after Lydia collapsed. Miss Marple returned to her table and lifted the recipe list again. The newer handwriting, tight, rushed, was not Lydia's. She had always written with confident loops and flourishes, even when irritated. No, someone else had altered the ingredients. Someone who wanted Lydia to prepare a dish that would appear familiar, yet contain something quite different. But Lydia, being proud and stubborn, might have resisted the change. She might have chosen to bake her usual recipe instead, which meant the tampered list would have served no purpose, unless someone ensured the cake used at the event was not Lydia's cake at all. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She could almost see the scene unfold. The wooden box, taken out in haste, the secret visitor with a quiet voice, the essence bottle Dora described, the scrap of blue-striped fabric caught in the hinge. Someone, in that hurried moment before the exchange, had likely swapped Lydia's cake with another one prepared earlier, one that contained the altered ingredients. And Lydia, eager to display her contribution, likely never suspected the substitution. She placed the cake proudly on the table, unaware she was not presenting her own creation at all. Miss Marple imagined the wooden box as the perfect decoy, an object people would focus on, whisper about, fear even, a clever distraction. While eyes turned toward its carvings and rumors of curses, the true sabotage rested quietly on a plate, disguised beneath a neat layer of walnut topping. A substitution hidden beneath the comfort of domestic routine. There were small inconsistencies that now made perfect sense. The faint scent Miss Marple had noticed unusual, slightly bitter, did not belong to Lydia's traditional walnut cake. Lydia had never used such an essence. The sharp look Mr. Clark gave the plate was not shock at her collapse, it was recognition. He knew something about the cake that others did not. Miss Marple placed the recipe sheet back into the box and folded her hands gently. Yes, sabotage had been dressed as familiarity, a domestic switch so subtle it had almost passed unnoticed. But, in street, Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew well that nothing truly vanished without leaving a faint thread behind. And now she had found the thread. Not only was the cake altered, it had been replaced entirely. The second twist had revealed itself quietly, elegantly hidden beneath the comforting veneer of an ordinary village gathering. By the time Miss Marple settled once more at her writing desk, the room felt unusually still, as though the quiet itself waited to see what she would conclude. She had gathered enough fragments, now small, delicate, easily overlooked, and laid them before her like pieces of a modest puzzle. Nothing sensational, nothing grand, but together they carried the shape of truth. She began with the handwriting. Lydia Harbot's script had always been distinct, large loops, confident curls, a certain flourish at the end of each line. The cramped correction on the recipe list bore none of these traits. Miss Marple compared the marks with a few notes she had gathered discreetly from the village hall. Mr. Clark's grocery list, Mrs. Fowler's note about committee duties, and a scrap of writing from Mrs. Draper's kitchen ledger. Only one matched the hurried, nervous strokes on the recipe paper. Mr. Clark. His handwriting was unmistakable when rushed. A slight downward tilt to the final letter, a faint pressure mark where he pressed too hard on the page, and the same irregular spacing between words that indicated agitation. Miss Marple traced the strokes gently. Yes, There was no doubt. Next came Dora Finch's account, the bitter-smelling bottle, the unseen visitor, the early morning quarrel. Miss Marple now recognized the significance of each detail. If Mr. Clark arrived at the Harbert cottage that morning quietly, by the back gate, then he must have brought something with him, something he insisted Lydia use, something she resisted. Perhaps he urged her to incorporate the essence. Perhaps she refused. Perhaps the quarrel turned sharp. And perhaps when Lydia would not yield, he resorted to another method entirely, the substitution. Miss Marple recalled the scrap of striped blue fabric caught inside the box hinge. Mr. Clark had worn a blue-striped cravat at the exchange, a small vanity of his. She remembered how he tugged at it nervously when Lydia displayed the box, how he recoiled when she collapsed, and how he had stared at the cake plate with such trembling recognition. Yes, it fit. He must have prepared a second cake, one altered with the essence he had added. He must have brought it to the cottage during the quarrel, intending Lydia to serve it as her own. But when she rejected his interference, he used the only opportunity left. He switched the cakes while Lydia prepared herself to leave. The wooden box, taken down in haste, had distracted her, and Dora, too frightened to intrude, failed to see the switch clearly. The motive, once emotional mist, now sharpened into clarity. Mr. Clark had coveted Lydia's recipe success for years. He believed she had stolen one of his creations long ago, a dispute no one else remembered, but one he had brooded over quietly, steadily, pride wounded, recognition denied. A small grievance that grew roots he could no longer untangle. Opportunity, motive, substitution. Miss Marple folded her hands and breathed a soft sigh. The strategy was clear now, not born of malice alone, but of a long-nursed resentment that had curdled into something far more dangerous. The final pieces had settled, and the truth, gentle but unmistakable, stood ready to be spoken aloud. The next morning carried a muted stillness, as though street. Mary Mead held its breath in quiet anticipation. Miss Marple prepared her sitting room with careful intention, fresh tea, a small plate of shortbread, and the wooden box resting unobtrusively on the side table. She arranged 2 chairs near the window where the light fell gently, casting no harsh shadows. When she finally opened her door to Mr. Clark, she did so with the same warm politeness she had shown him 100 times before. "Do come in, Mr. Clark," she said softly. "I've just brewed a new pot. I thought you might appreciate a quiet cup." He hesitated on the threshold, his eyes flickering in that way Miss Marple had noticed before, as though he were calculating escape without quite daring to flee. But he stepped inside and took the chair she offered. His fingers tapped once, twice, on his knee, before he clasped his hands tightly to stop the tremor. "Miss Marple," he murmured, "I'm not sure I should be visiting at a time like this." "Nonsense," she replied, pouring tea. "Tragedy often leaves people with a great deal on their minds. A cup helps loosen the weight." He accepted the cup, though his hands shook slightly as he raised it. Miss Marple let the moment rest, giving him room to breathe before she spoke again in her quiet, steady voice. "I have been thinking about Lydia Harbert," she began. "About her pride, her recipes, her way of holding on to small slights." Mr. Clark swallowed. "Yes, she was a difficult woman at times." "True," Miss Marple said gently. "And pride is a complicated thing. Wounds form easily, don't they? Especially when one feels their work has been taken, or credited wrongly, or dismissed." His breath caught just faintly enough that many might have missed it. Miss Marple did not. "One might even feel," she continued softly, "that an old rivalry was never properly settled, that one's own talent had been overshadowed." Mr. Clark placed his cup down too quickly. Tea sloshed over the rim. "I don't know what you're implying." Miss Marple reached for the wooden box, lifting it with careful, respectful fingers. "You see, I looked closely at the items inside, and at the note, the handwriting in particular. Very precise when calm, but cramped when hurried, much like the list you wrote for the grocer last week." His face drained of color. Miss Marple's voice remained warm, never accusing. "Mr. Clark, I don't believe you meant for things to go as far as they did. I think you wanted Lydia to understand, to feel humbled, perhaps even embarrassed. But resentment, once fed, rarely stays where one intends. A sound escaped him, half sigh, half sob. He covered his face with both hands. She stole my work, Miss Marple, year after year. Told everyone I was. Helped by her guidance, as though I had no skill of my own. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Pride can lead us into dark corners, my dear. Corners we never meant to visit. I only meant to teach her a lesson, he whispered. I never meant for her to die. The knock at the door came softly. Inspector Slack stepped inside with quiet efficiency, giving Miss Marple a respectful nod. Mr. Clark rose shakily, his eyes resigned, his voice hollow. Miss Marple watched him go with a gentle sadness. Human nature, she knew, was seldom monstrous at its core, only wounded, misguided, and unbearably fragile. The morning settles gently over street. Mary Mead, the kind of calm that follows a night of heavy truths. Davis returns to you now with a fresh cup beside him and a quiet thought lingering in the air. Cases like these remind us that mystery rarely lies in grand shadows, but in the small corners of human nature where pride, hurt, and longing weave themselves into knots. No, one notices until they pull tight. Lydia Harbott's fate grew not from malice alone, but from a slow accumulation of wounded moments. Old quarrels left unresolved, talents left unacknowledged, and bitterness kept tucked away like pressed flowers in a forgotten drawer. And in such places, even a single grievance can become far heavier than it appears. As Miss Marple often reminds us, people seldom act from wickedness outright. They act from fear, embarrassment, envy, or the quiet ache of wanting to be seen. And when those feelings are left to steep too long, they change the flavor of everything around them. So let your tea sit a moment and consider the gentle truth at the center of this tale. Truth cools slower than tea, and yet it always rises. Thank you, dear listeners, for sharing this quiet journey through Street Mary Mead. Tonight's truth rested in the smallest things, a wooden box tucked away too tightly, and a recipe note written in a trembling, hurried hand. Tell me, which clue first stirred your suspicion, and which character's motive felt most human to you? Your thoughts always shape these evenings. Thank you for being part of the Warm Pages circle, where mystery and comfort meet in equal measure. And as we close our book for the night, remember, tomorrow another kettle will boil.